But procurement, I produced a document for the Institute of Directors, which they called Towards Tesco. I wrote the document, they gave it the title. And really it's about holding a mirror up to public sector spend, seeing how far, with current structures and various things, we can actually deliver what is required of public sector procurement. And the first point you made is, why is public sector procurement important? Anyone know how much public sector procurement spend is? Sorry? 80 billion. The latest figure is assessed to be £221 billion, which is a massive figure. And if we put that in context, then for every man, woman and child living in this country, that's £3,500 a year. Anyone with a family of 4, that's 14 grand, if you're on average income. So, and each one of us on average, every person alive on average will invest nearly £250,000 into public sector procurement at that rate. It is a massive amount. And I think we have a right to expect that it is managed effectively and coherently. If we put £10,200 into an ISA, then we expect the fund manager to know exactly where the money is, how it's being invested, and so on and so forth. We expect him to be managing that fund very tightly. But we don't have that with this £221 billion. Another way of looking at the £221 billion, it is getting on for 10% of global gross, getting on for 1% rather, of global gross domestic product. It is a massive amount. And we can use that money in all sorts of ways to benefit the UK economy. But again, we don't have any overall approach to managing that money. It's managed in sort of packets. If we just take our education purchase spend, then our education purchase spend alone, if that's all we spent in the UK, public, private sector, domestic, then that would put us in the top 30% of global gross domestic product, of national gross domestic products. So we have spending absolutely massive amount, and it's one-third of public sector expenditure as well. So if we're to reduce the public sector spending deficit, if we're actually to introduce sustainability policies effectively, then public sector procurement has got to be at the heart of that. If we don't address that, then we will not deliver on any of these things. So how is public sector procurement organised? Well, many of you will know. We've got some big departments, big specialist organisations, Ministry of Defence. But as Ken pointed out, a lot of Ministry of Defence purchasing is actually common with local authorities when it comes to food, the same suppliers. And that applies right across the public sector. And I've worked right across the public sector in procurement, higher education, local government, central government, quite a lot of the time in various central government departments, non-departmental public bodies. And there is a huge commonality. There's a huge commonality of suppliers, a huge commonality in what we're trying to do. And it is not very coherently managed, even though there are some big organisations that are doing very much better now, and things are moving in the right direction. But the impetus now is perhaps for a bit of a step change. But the analogy I've used for a number of years is we have a multi-Tesco-sized purchase spend, but in many ways we're still adopting a corner shop model to the way we manage it. And how many of us believe that Tesco would be in business if it managed its procurement spend in the way that we do it, with 40,000, you could call them procurement organisations. There are certainly 40,000 procurement points, at least. There are several thousand procurement organisations. We've got procurement consortia, some of which actually compete with each other, procurement agencies and consortia, 40 or 50 of those, no one seems to know quite how many, and some of them compete with each other. And it's not exactly a terribly coherent approach. The other point that I've made in the paper as well, and this comes from all my experience of creating procurement organisations and running them, is that we had a huge amount of cost to procurement by having this fragmented approach. If any of you know how much it costs for the private sector to submit a tender, I worked out that the very simplest tender, if fully costed, would cost a private sector organisation about £1,000. And that'll be something that an SME bids for, but the very simplest, if fully costed. If they win one in 3 tenders, then it costs them £3,000 for every tender they win. If they have a profit margin of 10%, then they need to get about £30,000 of the business just to pay extra business, just to pay for every tender. And for many organisations, it is not worthwhile. The other problem they run up against is that there are lots of duplicate tenders. And when I took over the North West Centre of Excellence, when I became director of the North West Centre of Excellence Excellent. You see, that's your revenge. I found over 40 stationery agreements, and everyone claimed they were the best. This was in the 47 local authorities. And we did an analysis and found that stationery represented 0.04% of purchase spend. The cost of letting these agreements was greater than any benefit got from them. But also it caused the private sector no end of problems because there are different specifications, different tender terms and conditions, and a whole range of different procedures, different expertise, and it all adds a huge amount of cost to the private sector. In Greater Manchester as well, we found 150 specifications for tarmac, believe it or not, between the local authorities. And we worked out with experts that we needed 7. But very difficult to get people to agree to go for common specifications. Everyone likes their own. And again, it all adds cost. And the evidence was that if we went for 7, we could take out at least 10% of cost, possibly very, very much more, by approaching the market in a much more coherent way. And in the career I've had, when I've created some joint procurement organisations and some powerful procurement organisations, and when I've been able to afford to employ some really great specialists, and in 1 or 2 instances, the top 2 or 3 people in the country have been fortunate enough, this does go back over a long time, they delivered some outstanding results that I actually couldn't believe myself. The National Audit Office audited a number of those. One guy came up to me one day, and he was an expert in furniture, metals and wood. And at the Benefits Agency in the early 1990s, we spent nearly £20 million on office furniture. And he said to me, "What's the main cost of metal storage cabinets?" I said, "Steel?" And he said, "Yes, it's 60%. And I said, "Well," he said, "well, if we get one of our suppliers, because we had to use 3 because of the volumes, to buy on behalf of all the others, they can take advantage of a discount in the market that will enable them to save over 20%. I think the figure is about 30% actually. And I said, "OK, ask them to do that." And that was just the way the steel market was structured, and he knew it. So he asked them to do it, and he had quite a reputation in the industry. But the suppliers, what do you think they said? Nope. So we took the discount anyway, and told them it was their choice. In 3 months, they'd done it. He then came to me, though, one day, and he said, "Do you realise if that supplier came to us and said do you realise if we asked that supplier to buy British steel from Canada, we could save another 20%? I said, "Hang on, how's this?" And he said, "Oh, well, British Steel gets a subsidy on its exports to Canada, and we could take advantage of that." And I thought, well, Benefits Agency, Sun newspaper and so on, maybe not a good idea. But it illustrates what a real expert can bring. There are only 2 or 3 in the country. Procurement organisations can't have that expertise, not everyone, not all the thousands. And therefore, we need to enable that expertise is available to all. And that's really the basis behind collaboration. I think the way I would feel that the National Audit Office report has not gone far enough is it talks about collaboration, and I think collaboration is a bit of an old game. Collaboration, working with others, is quite expensive. When I moved to the research councils and created a joint procurement organisation to serve a number of independent bodies and shifted from collaboration, I was able to take 15% out of the cost of doing procurement in year 1. How do I know it was 15%? Because we spent 15% less on all of the staffing and everything else associated with it. So there was a very simple ratio there. And I think what we need, and certainly what the private sector needs as well, is to be able to see actually a logical structure and know that they are dealing with really good procurement organisations throughout. And the sort of structure I've proposed is, and it does seem to be being discussed seriously, and I think we will see it within the next few years, is that the specialist organisations continue to buy their specialist stuff, although some of the specialist organisations have a read across, such as the research councils buy research equipment, and so do universities. Well, why don't we just get a specialist research equipment procurement organisation and actually to start manage some of these American suppliers that are charging us far more than they charge companies in America but won't service the equipment in the UK.